So I was hoping we could start with just a little general background information. I
Sure.
know you're very well known through your Instagram work and your TikToks, but I know there are not quite as many people who know their background on you. So if you'd be comfortable just sharing some background info.
So comfortable. And also, I'm totally down to lean into discomfort. I think that's a really
Yes,
important trait that I think we should all embrace. So, you know, give me your best uncomfortable questions, and I'll be like,
absolutely.
hmm. um, yeah, I was born in Korea. Moved to the U.S. when I was 6 years old. Landed in Boston, which is like they love colonialism. Like that's like their jam, right? This is where
Yeah.
the Mayflower, and it was so great for us. The for us part, they don't actually include that part.
Yeah, there's the common schooling thing too. Music
What's
ed is really heavy, like so
hmm,
Boston area is the core of the common school movement, which
hmm,
is talked about as if it really is common, but it was really um, white people who could afford to have enough preliminary training to get into school because you had to read before you got in. And a lot of
hmm,
our formal music ed began in Boston, but of course, for a certain demographic. It's been
for
really
sure.
interesting learning the history of all that.
Yeah, that's crazy to think of how much that patriotic culture, because there's a lot of patriotism in Boston. I remember standing up every day to do the Pledge of Allegiance. My country, tis of the, and
Mm-hmm.
just that how that whole vibe can shape a national right curriculum, music curriculum. That's intense. I
Absolutely.
never thought about that.
Absolutely.
Well, that world shaped me, right? That was my first 2 years in America, so I think that certainly shaped me to a large extent. Then I moved to Seattle in third grade, and that's where I grew up. I started playing a recorder in third grade, and I joined the recorder ensemble because I loved it. Fourth grade, I started playing violin through the Seattle public school system because we had a pretty good instrumental music program where you could choose an instrument and learn to, and you'll get weekly class instruction on that instrument.
Yeah.
Started private lessons in sixth grade through the generosity of several teachers throughout my childhood who, gave me a great scholarship to learn. I guess the background being my dad. My dad was a PhD student. He came here with a family of four. Um, and he graduated with his PhD when I graduated from high school. So most of my childhood, um, it was I was a child. I was a dependent of an international student, grad student. So, we had a lot of educational privilege,
Mm-hmm.
but definitely not financial privilege. And I think that really shaped my life in a large way, and prevented me from ever thinking that I could do music full time. That
Yeah.
it was not for me. Um, yeah, and then started. I mean, I sang all the time, but I guess I joined an actual ensemble senior year of high school, vocal jazz, and then I
Oh.
started. Yeah, and then I started writing my own songs at age 16. My dad is a self-taught acoustic guitarist, and so I kind of learned some chords, and then just kind of tinkered around and wrote very emo, love
Yes.
songs for people who did not return return love for me. Um, yeah, that's some of the background.
Yeah. So informally,
Hmm.
what were the biggest influences in your own musical taste and musical development?
Oof. I think you always end up drawing it to your parents, or at
Mm-hmm.
least for me, it was a big part of it. And I mean, Korean music, right? I had Korean pop music. That was a
Mm-hmm.
big part of it. But even Korean pop music is not what we know today with
Mm-hmm.
BTS, etc. There were amazing Joni Mitchell-esque singer-songwriters that were singing kind of protest anthems in Korea. So that's my dad was really into that. My mom loved Stevie Wonder, and I would say Stevie Wonder is probably her favorite artist. And my dad's favorite artists were kind of more heavy metal, like Deep Purple and the Eagles. That was, that kind of classic rock was his jam. So, I think because of my immigrant background, there was a lot to draw from.
Hmm.
What I drew from the most were the emotions encapsulated in any said music that brought me closer to the things that I was feeling, and being able to express the things that often I, as the son of poor immigrants, repressed and tried not to talk about because I didn't want to disappoint my parents or make them suffer more than, everyone knew it was hard, right?
Yeah.
Like if you have to go and translate for your parents that we can't pay the rent, at the rental office, then like we all know.
Yeah.
So me being like, Mom, why is my life like this? That is, I would never have done that. And as a third grader, right, as a fourth grader, these are some of the things that I learned.
Hmm.
So whether it's playing Bach like G minor sonata and just pouring my soul and my sadness into that, whether it's Stevie Wonder and my dad's studying at the library, but it's my mom, me, and my sister, our tiny little boombox, and we're all like dancing together in the living room. Um, there were a lot of different genres and a lot of different artists, but I would say those moments where we could really truly express how we were feeling inside. Those were the biggest inspirations for me.
Oh, that's lovely. So I recall listening to an interview when you talked about coming to the States, knowing two words. And I'd like
Yes.
to hear more about your experiences as an English language learner as you integrated into the school system.
Yeah, I think it made me a great I think it made me a good musician. When you move at such a young age and you have to completely relearn your sonic world,
Mm.
and your sonic language, I think that will definitely grow your ears. I actually learned recently, so I'll tell the anecdote first. I remember arriving, so hello and thank you were the two phrases that I knew, and um, I remember feeling like English sounded so ugly.
Ah,
S's and T's are like like apparently those are the most common consonants in the English language. But
yeah,
in Korean, the T sound it's so harsh. Like they're really it exists, but it doesn't happen very often. And definitely the S sound doesn't happen very often either. So
yeah,
I remember just finding it extremely difficult to communicate who I was fully as a person, things I cared about, how smart I was, and but just feeling like a total idiot. And having
yeah,
my classmates and my teacher treat me as such, I think it was really difficult to navigate.
yeah. At what point did you feel most reflected when you were in school? Not necessarily musically, but
Sure.
or did you
Um,
feel reflected? Should be the question, huh?
um, yeah, honestly, I mean, Seattle is a very politically progressive city, but the Northwest is very white.
Yes.
And I mean, places like Oregon, where I live now, these were states that were founded mostly by white supremacists looking
Hmm.
to get out of California and start their own state. Um,
Yeah.
Portland was a sundown town,
Yeah.
and there's a real legacy of racism that's baked into the system that still exists and that you can just see when you walk down the streets. It's just a very white town. So I think it was very hard in general for me to see myself completely reflected. I also grew up in Seattle proper because my dad was a grad student at the University of Washington. So
Hmm.
my school didn't, if you wanted to hang out with Koreans and Korean Americans, you had to go out to the suburbs.
Mm.
And those church communities were very Korean. Although I would argue now, like that's still part of the American experience.
Hmm.
But it was a very kind of insular world that I didn't feel completely in. And then at school, there weren't that many Korean Americans, and so I didn't see myself reflected in the student body either.
Yeah.
Did I ever feel reflected? I mean, I guess when I think music, right, and music. dare I be too cliche, I think it does break down borders and boundaries, and there are elements of humanity that are so readily accessible through music. So whether it was the Emerson String Quartet that came through our high school and performed for us, or the Blind Boys of Alabama who came and like led us in singing,
Wow.
those were the moments where I felt like I could just be myself, and feel myself. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but most of my teachers, no, certainly not, and most of my classmates, no, as well.
Yeah. I like how in some of the TikToks I've watched, you really chip away at some of the incredibly trite and offensive things that you experience. I'm interested in I know because we have people watching who may not have seen anything. So
Mm,
some of the stereotypical things that you're accustomed to, some of the things that you maybe grew up accustomed to deflecting or having to confront, just being a Korean American person, and of course in the U.S. probably being lumped in as broadly Asian, which
of
we
course,
we tend to do in the
right?
U.S.
Yeah. You know, where are you from? Um, oh, I'm from Seattle. Like, where are you really from? And just yeah, that's one, right? There's so
Yeah,
many, right? Like, which Korea are you from? And there's so much to unpack even within that, right? Why are there two Koreas? Well, because because the Cold War, right? You had two empires.
and we are
uh
not taught. Our system does not teach us about.
no,
I,
we
as
don't.
an adult, learned the most specifics I've learned about, particularly our role and our war crimes that are still unacknowledged. I'm gonna get shut down after this interview, but I'm fine with it. It's
No,
worth it. It's worth it.
no. Well, the people,
No, I'm just kidding.
yeah, seriously. I mean, the people who I think don't know these histories, I think it's really important for them to learn, especially as
Hmm.
educators. I think having that context is absolutely crucial. And then the people who would cancel you because of this, bye. Like,
Right.
we didn't want you here anyway.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I think when you grow up with these microaggressions, um, you bury parts of yourself deep within,
Hmm.
and you try as much to assimilate and um, choose, quote unquote, choose to express yourself in ways that are acceptable to the majority. um,
Yeah.
yeah, so yes, I love, I don't know, Britney Spears. I mean, I do love Britney Spears. Come on. But whether it was where the clothes that I chose to wear, right, or even the different kind of linguistic affects that I absorbed from different people in my life.
Hmm.
It was really important that I appear to be American, so that I could hopefully not have to deal with a lot of those microaggressions. Um,
Yeah.
but you can't
Yeah.
change this. You can't
Right.
change this. So it
Right.
doesn't matter if I'm wearing a pea coat and and a tie. I was and penny loafers. I would still be asked. Um, yeah, all those questions are like, oh my god, I love K-pop, or oh my god, I love Korean food. Things like that. Just the extra.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The automatic othering.
Right.
We talk a lot about just the emotional labor of showing up in spaces and knowing you have to put a little bit of armor on and get ready for. I mean, obviously, we come from different backgrounds, so it's experienced in different ways. But yeah.
To be on the other side of white supremacy, right? Where we are, even in our daily existence, performing our identity, right,
Hmm.
to the system. That in and of itself is very exhausting. Even if everything is outwardly normal, or
Yeah.
like, oh, you seem so relaxed. In my mind, I'm always thinking one more layer,
Right.
even if it becomes automatic. Yeah.
Right. And I think a thing I didn't really unpack until I was an adult was,
Hmm.
and is kind of just leading to a question.
Hmm.
Just as a Black person, I've
Hmm.
been finding what my Blackness means for me, having grown up, predominantly white school setting up
Hmm.
until high school. And
Hmm.
so I've gotten to this point where I'm like, I'm going to intentionally display my Blackness and not
Hmm.
shut that down when I'm in front of people and in predominantly white spaces. And then
Mm.
I go, is this really my blackness or is this really another response to whiteness?
Mm.
And I just spiral.
Yes. All of that spiraling.
It's just constant.
But I mean, but it's a performance anyway, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
whatever we do, you're right. It is a performance and it's exhausting. But I think now I'm at the point too where, well, if it's a performance, I'm gonna choose what to perform,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna perform in a way that pushes back on the things that have so, like, for all my life, absorbed me and tried to make me into that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So at what time in your life did you feel like you began to unpack all of that and what was the impetus for you?
I mean, I think a large part of it happened in high school. I
Mm-hmm.
went to Garfield High School in the Central District of Seattle, Washington. I think it's a mostly black neighborhood, with a lot of Southeast Asians, as well.
Mm-hmm.
But then the accelerated process program, like the high achieving kids, were also brought into this space. So it was a really interesting mix of teenagers. I think the year that I graduated was 42% black, 36% white, 16% Asian. So I think race relations was a constant topic that we were at such basic levels, and I think everybody said a lot of stupid stuff,
Yeah.
but it was something that you couldn't ignore and you couldn't pretend that it didn't exist.
Yeah.
um, so I think, yeah, we had some great kind of conversational forums and school-wide discussions that happened. I think that was, um, one of the places that I started to really fall in love with race and the topic of race and ethnicity. And then when I went to college, um, I took gender, family, and cultural identity in Asia and the US. And I freaking loved it. There weren't at that time, this is 2005, 2006, there weren't that many Asian American studies classes at Yale.
Mm-hmm.
But there were amazing African American studies programs. And there was also, a pretty awesome focus on, Muslim American identity. And so I fell into these classes and I learned so much about how culture, how music can serve as a vehicle for creating identities that are outside of the white norm.
Yeah.
And I think that gave me tremendous energy as well as a framework to think about my own identity and my own community that I grew up in, and then also, all the lessons of the civil rights movement and that era, like that golden era of protest music, and how uplifting and empowering that was.
Mm-hmm.
Taking, like, learning and absorbing as much as I can from that, so that, uh, and I guess more importantly, borrowing from that so that I can also express and help from my own identity and perspective take down white supremacy.
Yeah. I love how you use the word frameworks because obviously now we have a lot of contention in many states. Here in Texas, it's pretty bonkers.
Mm,
And of course, critical race theory is being used as a proxy for all the things. Um, and of course, we're fresh off of Juneteenth, and so there's a lot of pride in the hard work that people have put in to get Juneteenth to be a national holiday. We have Miss Opal Lee here who's worked for decades, but then at the same time, it's like we are also very aware that the very frameworks to describe anything that is being experienced or that needs to be addressed are being
mm,
chipped away at.
mm,
Um, and I'm interested in how you've seen that show up. We're geographically in very different places, and we know whiteness is everywhere, but obviously where you are leans more more progressive. So,
yeah.
is that something that you've encountered much in your community, or any particular pushback aside from the fact that you're on social media and social media is full of pushback?
Yeah. Well, first, I think, so America was founded on the principle of white supremacy, right? So anyone outside of that norm were were erased,
Yeah.
sometimes violently, sometimes just moved, or sometimes incorporated, right? California was filled with Mexicans, and then like, actually, we're going to move the border. This is now the United
Mm-hmm.
States.
Mm-hmm.
So with that in mind, whites the that racist mantra is everywhere. It's in the Korean American community. It's in Black American communities. Every community, right? Because of the fact that it is so entrenched in our fabric of existence, it is everywhere. That to me is why critical race theory is. It's like critical race theory. It's like, no, just learning about racism, right, and learning
Right.
about race, um, and thinking about race is really important to do from an early age.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a high school educator. I was a high school English teacher for 4 years before I moved to doing music full time. And we read a great Sherman Alexie novel. Sherman Alexie is a Native American author
Yeah.
who's up in Seattle, and um, you know, I had this fierce argument with a student after class, who basically just refused to. We were arguing about the Washington football team and their former name, and it was like let's make up a name, Bob. Like, can't you see this is offensive, right? What if and I drew like a stereotypical Chinaman, right, with like a rice hat and buck teeth. Like, what if this was our mascot? Like, would that be? And we just had a really intense argument. I had a great conversation with a colleague after, saying, you did a great job. Who watched that encounter, and he said, just realize that that's the first time he's had that conversation, right? That's the first
Yeah.
time that he's been exposed to your perspective,
Yeah.
because they grew up with their parents, and I grew up with my parents, and all of the smallness of their worldview I inherited. Um,
Mm-hmm.
this is exactly why we should be having those conversations in kindergarten and first grade, right? So that by the
Exactly.
time they get to junior year of high school, our level of understanding is just so much greater, on our ability to talk about equality, justice, and liberty, and also what we need to do to actually achieve those things is at a much greater level than assuming that no, things are equal right now, things are free, and things are why are you critical race theory.
Right. Right.
um, yeah. So, I think that happens in music too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And making sure that we can approach these topics not just in terms of theory,
Mm-hmm.
um, but through the way that we really actually change, which is through emotional understanding, and moments of emotional epiphany that actually motivate us to change. And that happens through the arts.
Yeah. And that kind of leads to my next question
Mm,
about just how effective you feel music can be in social activism. And, obviously it's such a big part of what you do.
mm.
Would you just kind of share more about the place it holds for you?
It's not everything, right? It,
Yeah.
it goes hand in hand with policy and a lot of different things. When I was getting burnt out of teaching, I was applying for graduate school programs in ethnomusicology, and I wrote, I'm going to be studying, Asian American musicians who are using music as a vehicle for social justice. Once I actually started writing the PhD proposal and talking to PhD students, I realized I didn't want to be in a pardon me. I didn't want to be in a library and study music that was being created,
Mm-hmm.
or analyze music that was being created. I wanted to be making that music. I wanted to be changing the culture itself, and be on the front lines of creating these new art forms that encourage us to think about who we are, as people of color, or who we are. How can we build coalitions within POC communities to actually take down white supremacy? How do we also criticize our own communities for our inability to support each other, or sometimes our willingness to subscribe to white supremacy because we have some level of relative privilege?
Right.
So yeah, I think music is really important for that. When I get up on a stage and sing about being an immigrant, um, and the life that I've lived, I have some amazing conversations with young Asian American kids afterward because they didn't know that this was possible. They
Yeah.
just they and that was the case for me. I decided not to go to music school because it was either become the next classical, violinist soloist, and practice 12 hours a day and play the music of dead white men, for the rest of your life, and that was it.
Yeah.
That was it. There just weren't any other Asian Americans who were making their own music. So being able to participate in that movement, I think it's really important for activating younger and younger, students, who will become you know, future owners of the world we live in today.
Yeah. So, how did you get into the looping work that you do? I know you started writing as a teenager, but was that around the same time that you were?
No, that was around age 20. I really, so when I got to college, I stopped playing violin classically. I could have
Hmm.
joined symphony and I chose not to. I joined an a cappella group, and then I just started jamming and just really getting into improvisation,
Yeah.
because I did not want to play etudes 3 hours a day. Actually, not that I ever did that, but but that was what would have been expected of me, right?
Yeah.
I wanted to improvise because I wanted to find my own voice, um, within a given framework. What do I have to say? And so that's actually the primary reason I first bought the looping pedal. I wanted to be able to record some chords and then just have, be able to improvise over some chords without depending on four or five different people always having to be there. And then I saw an Andrew Bird concert. He's an
Mm.
amazing violinist looper,
Yeah.
and I realized how much this piece of technology could also become an instrument in and of itself. Um, and yeah, that's when I think I started to really kind of dive deeper into looping.
After high school, you didn't do formal studies, so I'm interested in skills you feel like you've picked up as a
Mm,
musician that a traditional teacher likely would have not thought to instill in you or value at all.
for sure. I mean, definitely in the classical violin world, I mean, improvisation is just not really a thing.
Yeah.
Um, uh, okay, a couple of few formative moments. Okay, one, uh, it's 2 a.m. I'm in the basement of my a cappella group people's house and we're jamming to the Beatles' Abbey Road and just playing all the songs from the beginning of the album to the end of the album. Um, that I'm not gonna do that with my violin teacher.
Right.
um, but just being forced to think on my feet, and to really lean into the imperfection of the sound that I'm making, but the beauty of the moment that we're creating with each other. um, so that I would say that education, right, I'm not going to get in that space.
Yeah.
The I also worked with a lot of dancers. As soon as I started looping and doing some violin looping, I had an opportunity to jam with, my friends who love to dance, and just being able to jam across mediums like that, where I'm completely free to make any sound that I want, but my cue is the movements of another
Mm.
person, the artistic movements of a dancer. And then you have this amazing kind of cycle where they're listening and moving to me, and I'm watching and also playing music. So it's this beautiful conversation that's happening, across languages. And so that's another really, fond memory that I have, that I think really helped me become the musician that I am today.
Yeah.